Hello everyone, and welcome to this episode, the inclusion and equality one of the Women Talking About Learning podcast. I'm Andrew Jacobs. This episode has been on the list for a little while, and we were really keen to make sure we were able to have a full conversation around the topic. To that end, we're delighted to welcome 4 guests, experts in their field, to talk through this subject. Our first guest is Sandra Camacho. Sandra is a Franco-Colombian-American inclusive and equitable design strategist, educator, and advisor, working under the alias Sandra By Design. Sandra started her career at Google, where she spent 8 years in product, digital marketing, and learning and development in the US and Europe, and today helps teams around the world build thriving work cultures and socially impactful solutions. Our second guest is Sharon Ehrlich. Sharon is a Bronx-raised native New Yorker. After spending nearly 2 decades in executive and leadership roles for global technology companies, she founded Living While Leading, an executive coaching service which focuses on supporting women IT executives. Sharon also hosts the Living While Leading podcast, which focuses on leadership and female empowerment. Our next guest is Emily Decker. Emily is part of the team at Context Translations, where she first discovered the world of learning through working as a translation project manager for e-learning agency clients. Now head of client partnerships, she's passionate about helping companies take their learning global, from localizing learning content of all kinds to making sure it is culturally and regionally sensitive for learners around the world. Our final guest is Leslie Short. Leslie brings 4 decades of experience with the Cavu Group, advising companies on expanding their culture through diversity, inclusion, and open dialogue. Starting as a professional ballet dancer at 12, Leslie has built a diverse career in Europe and Asia, and as well as this, she's a chaplain, activist, mental health aide, mediator, and coach. We've an expert group here, so please sit back and enjoy a solid 45 minutes which will engage, inspire, and inform you. This is Women Talking About Learning. This is Sandra, Sharon, Emily, and Leslie talking about inclusion and equality.
Hello, everyone. I'm Leslie. I'm calling in from Philadelphia, from the United States. I go between Philadelphia and New York. Emily, I love to know where you're calling in from.
Hi, Leslie. Thank you. I'm calling in from Leamington Spa in the Midlands in the UK. And it's just a real pleasure to be here. From sort of the work that I've done, seeing an increasing focus on inclusion and equality in the workplace, especially since the pandemic, and kind of seeing how my own interests of language and culture have fed into that. I'm just fascinated to kind of hear everybody's perspectives on this topic today, especially knowing that we have a group of women who have lived in different cultures and lived lives in different languages. I can't wait to hear everybody's experiences. So thank you so much. Sharon, where are you calling in from?
I'm calling in from Vienna, Austria. So I'm really happy to be here. The topic is also fascinating for me because, as you probably have noticed, I am a Afro-Latina woman, which means that I have lots of lived experience with lack of inclusion and lack of equality, also being a female, identifying as female. And so the topic is one that's very close to my heart because of my lived experience and also because of the work that I do. So similar to you, Emily, some of my work takes me down the path of this topic. And so it's very much front and center in my life. How about you, Sandra?
Thanks, Sharon. Yeah, I relate a lot to you because I'm also a Latina living in Europe, but in Paris specifically. So I would say that when you mentioned your lived experiences kind of really come to the fore and inspire, especially what we're going to talk about on this topic. To me, the term intersectionality immediately comes to mind. And I know we're going to broach that topic at some point. But it's something I try to integrate as much as possible in my work. So I'm more in the design space, specifically inclusive and equitable design. So already I'm thinking equality versus equity. There are some distinctions between those two terms, and excited to talk about how that intersects with learning. And Leslie, we didn't hear a little bit about what you're doing.
Well, I'm doing all of the above. I guess that's why I kicked it off. I am an African-American woman that has lived in Vienna and also lived in France and have dual nationality, spent some time in London and England. And so that definition of inclusion is what I would love to also have a conversation about, what that actually means, because I think everyone wants to lump it into one thing. And I'm very much about inclusion is a feeling, it's a sound, it's a way of being, and it's an action. And I think people just go, oh, we invite everyone in, then everyone will be good. And so I'm someone that goes, no, that's not how that works. And that's not how that works in learning, because we know that every individual learns differently. And to be inclusive, you've got to break that down to the individual and the best way that they can learn so that they can be the best employee or the best person they can be within a situation.
Yeah, you make a really good point there, Leslie. And something that also comes up to my mind is the whole topic of belonging. Because like you said, you can include everyone, but if they don't feel like they belong there, if they don't feel like the inclusion was done with them in mind and with some intention behind it, it really can have a absolute negative effect, because people understand authenticity. It may not be in their face the moment they enter the inclusive environment. And I say that with air quotes, but it doesn't take very long for one to realize that some of these actions can be performative. And so I think the idea of being intentional about how people are meant to feel like they belong from a real authentic place is so key in all of the work that we're doing. I worked in sales enablement for a long time, so I also have experience in learning, and I have worked for multinational corporations where we have put together learning in one language, rolled out education in one time zone, and then we're shocked that none of our people did not feel like they were upskilled and could not adopt or adapt any of the learning and drive the outcomes that we wanted. And it was really unfortunate. But this was the modus for a very long time. Slowly, this is starting to change. But, I've seen that from the other side, and I know how detrimental that can be.
Yeah, such a good point there, Sharon, about sort of language being used as a tool to foster that sense of belonging. I think, if you join a company and, you're going through an induction and it's in a language that's not your native language, already there's that barrier, there's that otherness, I think, that you're kind of having to overcome a barrier before you can even engage with that. I think in a world now where companies are so concerned with employee retention and wanting that kind of people-centric feeling within a company, language is such a useful tool to be able to establish that. So I love what you said there.
But can I throw one thing in before we get to the word belonging? And I know we don't want to get stuck on this, but I'm a big believer that only you get to decide where you belong. And it's not that it's the job of a company or organization to set the tone so that you walk in, that you see yourself there. It's not their responsibility to see you there. I walk in and I decide it may be the best inclusive place in the world, but it's still not for me. And I think we have to also don't remember that just because you fit there doesn't mean you belong there. And so you have to decide that, because that's the only way you're going to continue to learn, to know what's best for you in that situation. And Sandra, I know you wanted to say something. Sorry, I jumped in.
No, it's fine. I don't want to derail, but I wanted to just go back to the point on language, because I think that a lot of the times by default, people think of language as, for instance, English versus Spanish versus French and so forth. But I think it's also the jargon that we use, thinking about, for instance, if we're referring to English, kind of using plain English. And I know that that's something that comes a lot up when we're thinking about how do we design learning experiences for folks who are neurodivergent, or for folks who come from different or have had different educational paths where they may not have been exposed to certain sorts of vocabulary or certain sorts of terms. So I love the idea of just kind of also constructing what we mean by language, and that it's not always the language that we speak in a particular country or region of the world, but also how we speak. And that language isn't just verbal or textual. So I just wanted to touch on that point. But the belonging one, that's a big question. So I will maybe I'll turn the baton over to someone else to react to that.
No, but it is language. I worked on a project and it was great. They had 6 different interpreters as I was doing this workshop, and including a ASL interpreter. And we forget that it's American Sign Language. That's not the same if you have an international group. So when we do speak about language, we really do need to break that down of who are we having this conversation with beyond ourselves and look at that. And that's a big issue sometimes when companies are doing surveys. They may send it out only in English and sometimes in Spanish, and then wonder why they didn't get all their employees to respond. Yet there was employees in the field that did not, and this goes back into being inclusive and equitable, that especially with the park, that may not have even laptops to get the email to do the survey that's not in their language. So when we're looking at these things, who's responsible for breaking down inclusion beyond what you think works for you?
Right. And you know what, Leslie and everyone, modality also fits into this, right? Because when you think about it, we all learn in different ways. And the way that I learn is also dependent on what the topic is. If I'm not a person who's very technical, so I have to go on YouTube and watch a video on how I have to set up a watering system in my garden because that involves hoses and this and that, and it's not my thing, right? But on the other hand, there are some things where you can just give me text and I can read it and I get it. And this has to also be top of mind when we're designing our learning solutions. Not everybody learns the same way. And, when folks are setting their budgets, they set a budget for, we are going to put together this e-learning, and they think that's the end of it. But guess what? You have to think very wide about what does that really mean?
That's so true. Yeah. And I understand as well that sort of those learning preferences are so different across different cultures as well. You have some cultures that really enjoy learning collectively, others that are much more kind of individualistic about things, other cultures that enjoy reams upon reams of extra information, others that prefer kind of a very light touch approach. So yeah, just going back to our original point about inclusion and just all the myriad of aspects that this can kind of really encompass.
And Emily, I wanted to build on. Oh, sorry, Leslie.
No,
don't mean to cut you
please.
off.
No, please don't.
I was just going to build on Emily's point because that got me to thinking about, Sharon, what you mentioned at the very beginning about thinking of your own lived experiences. And as you were speaking, Emily, I was thinking of, I did actually a master's program in France, even though I did my undergraduate education in the US. So I was able to compare how we learn in France compared to the US, and it is very, very different. There's a lot of philosophy here and a lot of top-down education, and a lot of that translates into the workplace and into how kind of adult learning and kind of professional education, how those experiences are designed for folks. So I'm curious just to hear from you all kind of how you draw from your own lived experiences, especially since we have such a diverse group here that's lived all over the world and across languages. How do you kind of bring that into the L&D work that you do to ensure that it's kind of anchored in your experiences, but that also reflects the diversity of folks who are going through learning programs and learning experiences?
I think that's the bonus, that we've lived so many different places and experienced it, because at least for myself, when I'm looking at something, I'm not only looking at it through my eyes. I'm taking into consideration who's in the room or who may come into the room. And so then I'm building it the best I can to make sure I'm doing those touch points. And then asking, once it's there, I still don't want to assume that because I lived in a country, I still know what it is. So I still make a point to ask in advance with someone, find some type of colleague, or I'll stop anyone on the street. Shocking, I know. And just say, hey, what do you like? What do you want to see? And I think we forget that we don't ask the questions of the people we're actually supposed to be serving. And that's the saying, nothing about us without us. And that came from the disability community. And it was adapted during, the civil unrest. And so I think that's the most important thing, is that I know how I learn, as an ex-ballerina, when I was in rehearsal. And if I messed up a step, if I could dream it at night and see it, I could dance it the next day without any issue. But I know that that's not everyone. Everyone's not visual that way. So you must be able to give people alternatives.
Yeah. And I also think when we talk about designing learning, that there has to be an element of co-creativity. And this is going back to what you were talking about, Leslie. For us to design things in a vacuum, it goes against the whole notion of what that means to develop learning. And when I think of a co-creative process, if I have a client who has an outcome that they want to drive, there were so many questions I have to ask to understand about the culture, about the organization, about just because they've put an outcome in black and white, I'd like for them to talk me through what that outcome really means to them. And so this means that there has to be so much communication in both directions to really even start to embark on developing something. Because like you said, Leslie, you end up developing something for a single consumer and not for everybody else in the room, right?
Emily, how do you find that where you are? Is it a collective?
Yeah, I was just thinking actually that last point that you just made there, Sharon, about kind of designing content for a single sort of perspective, if you like. That's something that we see all the time, where we are kind of, obviously we're approaching learning from a very different perspective. We are seeing content that has already been created and is now in the process of being transformed so that it's suitable for other languages and cultures. And we will often see content that's been created just in English and is referencing very specific sociocultural instances, like the whole kind of immigration situation in the US with second generation, third generation sort of immigrant families, that just doesn't have the same ramifications and social context that it does in European countries. So when you're referring to kind of second generation in the US, that's not something that can be just immediately translated into German, French, because that whole context just does not exist in those languages. There is an alternative kind of equivalent that perhaps we can kind of make reference to, but there's that kind of extra step involved in making sure that it's replicating that impact or is kind of calling up a different experience for what the new target audience will be. So it was kind of interesting to hear you mention that then. I think that's often a step that's kind of forgotten or neglected, is that like localization, I suppose, before it even goes to translation.
Well, that brings in equality versus equity. Everyone wants to say, well, that's what we did for so-and-so. Well, we did it for that country, or that person learned that way, so we're good. And I'm like, I don't want to be equal. I want to have equity. I want to have access to many different things. And I think that's the way that when I'm looking at anything to do, any type of learning program, any type of workshop, any of that, I want to make sure I have options. That to me is equity. Equality, even for women, as we know, when we're going for jobs, well, John got paid. Sorry if there's any Johns out there. John got paid that. So aren't you happy? No, maybe John accepted that and didn't know how to negotiate. I want the equity to be able to have the access to continue to grow and to move forward. And that's something I think gets lost in the definition of words and how we use it, whether we're learning or negotiating. Sharon, you're shaking your head.
Well, yeah, you know what? You triggered me there, Leslie, because it made me think about when I went to university. So just to give you a little bit of context, I come from very humble beginnings, and I was raised in the Bronx and went to a school, was in a school district that was underfunded. So, but I was a bright child. And so when I got to university, this, of course, we didn't have the vocabulary for it back then, but everybody was equal, and so the lessons were delivered to the masses. But there was a gap for me there because the education that I had as a high schooler was very different from the other kids there, and there were absolutely no accommodations. And I'm not trying to suggest in any way that the professor should have bent over backwards to make accommodations for me. But as a university, there were no programs in place to sort of cushion that a bit for kids like me who didn't come from the best school districts, but still had the will and the desire to learn, but we needed a little bit more support to get there. And so, you just made me think of all of that and how I started to even doubt my own intelligence, because I just thought, gosh, these kids are so much smarter than I am. And you know what? I graduated with fairly decent grades for all the partying I was doing, but it was painful, and it didn't have to be as painful as it was.
Yeah, I mean, this is definitely many discussions that I have in the work that I do. Especially, I'm in a lot of community spaces, so with other design practitioners, not always in the learning world, but folks who are trying to redesign, whether it's products or services that we use, and trying to figure out how do we start to design, taking into account the fact that not everybody is on the same playing field. So I think this is kind of where we start to distinguish equity from equality, in the sense that we do not all face the same barriers in life, and the barriers that certain groups face are structural or systemic in nature, meaning that they are embedded in so many aspects of society and laws and policies and organizational norms and culture that it's not just as simple as perhaps one accommodation here and there, but it actually requires us to really fundamentally change how we design. And I think the hardest part of this work that I see with design practitioners, which are the primary folks that I'm building learning experiences for, is that it requires a lot of introspection. It requires a lot of tough conversations with people about social power and who has social power, who are we designing for, who are we centering in the design of learning solutions, learning experiences. And I'm just curious to hear from any of you. So Emily, Sharon, Leslie, whoever wants to weigh in on this, just kind of how you have been navigating those conversations. Are they happening? And what's been kind of the most productive or kind of fruitful aspect of those conversations?
I worked with a company that designed a standing desk. And the way that the design you had to lift it. And I go to the gym every day, so I think I'm fairly strong. I may not look it, but I'm fairly strong. I could not raise this desk for anything. Long story short, it came down that it wasn't the way women's shoulders, the way we actually are physically built, it was difficult for us to maneuver. Because I kept having women come in and like, can you try this? And I'm like, I know I'm not weak. I went to the company and said, I don't know, did you test this with women? Because I see that most of the people in your design department are men. So when you did it, who did the sample? And they were like, you know what? We didn't, Leslie. They redesigned the desk though. They redesigned on their next go round because of that conversation. Because then all of a sudden they start doing focus groups and women could not lift it that way. But it was never a thought to say we're building something that's universal, supposed to be universal, yet half of society can't even lift it to use it.
No, that's wild. But I guess that shows us also it's a great demonstration of equality versus equity, meaning equality, you design the same thing for everyone, but underneath that, it's actually being designed for a specific group of people, goes unsaid. And equity, it's like, how can we design it so we take into account everyone's individual capacities and conditions and environments and barriers, and it's not an easy shift. I think focus groups and user research helps with that, but I'm trying to work with clients on that, and it's very hard to make that shift.
I was going to say, one thing that we find ourselves in dialogue with our clients a lot is the whole aspect of gender. I think with the way that the world has developed around gendered language and wanting to be more inclusive, that's actually causing a bit of a challenge in the translation world, because you all know from the other countries that you've lived in, there are some languages out there that have gender almost hard-coded into their language. So now this idea of something that doesn't necessarily identify as male or female, how do you express that in languages that have traditionally had that embedded in their grammar? And what happens if we have a gender neutral or non-binary character? How do we then communicate that or reflect that in the language that's being used? And so quite often that is a conversation that has to happen at quite a very granular level, and it will differ depending on the language that we're translating into. There are some languages that have that gender neutrality already available. There are others that we're having to be a bit more creative about, and it's a very singular conversation. Every client, every country is doing it so differently. So how can we make sure that we're being sensitive to the individual preferences of a particular target culture, target language? So it's a really interesting debate that's happening. There's no immediate solution, but it's how do we make sure that equality is reflected in a way that's sensitive but still reflects the integrity of the language and culture. It's a real fascinating one.
Awareness. How do we make people aware beyond what they're like? But you're included. You were invited. You can come golfing anytime. You can come, any of those things that people will say that makes you feel, they make you feel like you've been included. So, that no, you can just come, join the conversation, join this class, but yet you weren't really invited and or feel that you want it when you're in there. I'm sure each of us have had that moment where you're just like, why am I here? What is happening?
I was going to ask you all, actually, have you found that sort of living abroad or in different countries, has that idea of inclusion or equality shifted depending on where you've lived?
Who wants to start?
Oh. Go ahead, Sharon. I'll jump in after.
Sharon, yeah.
Gosh, there were so many ways to answer that question. So let me start first with, being a melanated American woman living in a country that is 90% white, right? So one would think that would be a problem for me. But I have to tell you, I have an American passport. And so that sort of changes the game, because if you want to think of it, and this is going to sound very brutal, but of having a passport hierarchy, the American passport trumps many others. And so, the moment I open my mouth and people detect my American accent when I speak German, I won't say that I haven't been confronted with situations where I've been excluded, but not to the degree as others who live in this country. And so, so that's one element, and then it's so nuanced. That's why it's not a very easy question to answer. But then I can also tell you that I worked for a company which shall remain nameless, and I was told in very clear language by a person who spoke English as their native language that I did not fit in. And think about what this means, that you don't fit in. So it's like you have some sort of I'm a visual person, so I sort of think of like the shape, and they couldn't squeeze me into this shape because I didn't think like them, I didn't behave like them. And on one hand, I thought that they would welcome having someone who has a different perspective, different lived experience, different point of view, different way of approaching problems. But for them, they wanted to continue to walk the path of sameness. And how did I manage it? That was the question you asked, Emily. I had to part ways with them because there was just no way that I could bend myself. There's an age where you might be willing to do that to move your career forward. But then there's a certain age where you just say, you know what, I can't deal with that. I need to feel well where I'm working. I need to feel like people appreciate me for who I am authentically. And I'm not going to try to squeeze myself, into a peg shape that is not my shape. And so I did part ways with them. Not everybody has the possibility to do that. So I have to say that I was quite privileged to be able to do that. And I recognize that privilege, but I know that that's not so easy for many people.
Brilliant answer.
Oh. Starting out, I can't only say out of the country. I want to say in this country and then going out of the country. When you're chosen at the age of 7 to be trained as a classical ballet dancer as a little Black girl, no one tells you belong. From the moment you audition, that I'll never have a career. Yet I had a career in the United States and then moved to Europe. And I'll speak about Vienna for a moment, where I was on TV and in theater, and I would be in the center of the town on the Jumbotron, yet no one wanted to sit next to me on the train or speak to me, or I had an older woman come up and want to rub and touch my skin. It was also the first place I was called, the N-word. And I just went, well, if I'm the first one you've seen, I won't be the last one. And I just kept going to the post office, mailing that letter, because that's how I was raised. So if I'm the first one, then, oh, well, get ready. We're going to have some fun times together. And then you do a little prayer. When I was in Paris, and looking for an apartment beyond where the artist lived with my soon-to-be husband at that time, who was white French. And they were like, you're not going to get this apartment. You're not going to put your name on it. And it was someone else who said, wow, my sister's name was Leslie, and I am, a minority. I'm going to make sure you all get this apartment. So there's always been, with the one of how someone wants to exclude you, there's always been a way that I figured out that's your issue, not my issue. And so if it's where I feel I belong, then again, I'm going to say, I'm going to figure out how I maneuver this. And if it gets to a point where it's not, as Sharon said, then that's when I have the privilege to move myself when this doesn't suit me. But I've gone through a lot of different things that been excluded because of the color of my skin, or I'm a woman with a mouth. I lived in Japan. I opened up a theater. They told me I was ruining their culture, yet it was rated the best business venture in 1994. So, there's things that I think we encounter along our way, especially when you live in different countries, where you're going to get pushback, but yet you're going to get praise because of that American passport. So it depends on the situation. Sandra, you're shaking. I know.
Yeah, because I'm in France now, but I'm also an immigrant to the US because I was born in Colombia and my family's all from Colombia. And so English is my second language, but I speak it natively. And Spanish has gone a little bit down the list. My experience growing up, I grew up in what I didn't know at the time was a very conservative area of California, where there was actually a lot of diversity, but there was a lot of anti-Latino racism. Some of which I internalized. So I stopped speaking Spanish. I didn't feel comfortable kind of being myself. And, I have lighter skin tone, so I know that I have privilege through that lens, but it actually has a huge impact on your identity and who you are. And because even in the US, I felt like I didn't belong. I was always asked, where are you from? What are you? Then I moved to France, and then it's always the accent. It's like, I'll never be, I have a French passport as well, and I will never be seen as French here. But there isn't that same kind of stereotypes with Latin American immigrants. And as you all said, like the American passport, it takes precedence. And so I was always seen kind of as American, but like ethnically ambiguous. Like, we don't know what you are, but we're not going to at least, put a bunch of stereotypes on you. But it's still, this actually happened to me so I was doing a training actually in French. This was about 5 years ago. And I received feedback from a participant at the end of that training that she should have done it in English. And I was like, I've been speaking French for 15 years. I have a degree in French. I work so hard, maybe I messed a little bit my improvisation in the workshops, but I was like, even then, someone had to point out the fact that I don't speak perfect French and that I'm not French. So again, I don't know why I let that comment stick with me 5 years later. I've gotten a lot better, of course, but yeah, you just get these signals even when the tables are turned and you're the facilitator and you're navigating people through a learning experience, and they even make you feel like you don't belong. It's not just the participants, but even the facilitators or the trainers, because of the cultural divides or because of other identities that people may hold. So it's an interesting kind of topic of cultural belonging, and it's complex, I have to say.
That question of why are you here? I love that question. That's one of my favorite questions when I show up in an event and I'm the only one. And I know that they want to say it and ask. And sometimes I go, oh, I can read your bubble. Why am I here? Why are you here? And I just throw them completely off because I'm like, we're here to see the same event, aren't we? And that just throws them. So sometime I'll bring it before they will, when I can feel, you can feel that heat from someone that they're dying to say something,
Yes.
but they're trying to be proper. That just means that it's our responsibility as those that help others learn to remember to look around and see who is being left out, who is not being included at that moment. Is it the silent person that's in the class that's just shy, that learns differently? How do you handle that when you get someone that may not want to speak, but knows all the answers or brilliant or...
I mean, I think this is where advocacy really comes in, right? You if you're in a position of privilege or power and you recognize that, and you're a leader, I mean, it's important that you're a leader, because people who are not leaders won't do this. But if you're a leader, you start to understand, I have to advocate for this person. So whether that means you stop everybody in the room and say, I think this person has an opinion and I'd like to hear it. Or you pull that person to the side and say, I know you know all the answers. How come you aren't raising your hand? What's going on? What's behind it? And try to peel that back a little bit and understand, and then support them in a way that can help them gain the visibility that they need, so that people understand that they are a shining star. They just shine in a different sort of a way. They're not the loudest shining star, but they are impactful and powerful. And it's not an easy thing to do. You have to start to train yourself. And I think as leaders, one of the things that it behooves us is to bring others along when we see that they can do better, is to call them out on it and say, hey, you're great at what you're doing, but you could do a little bit more. And did you recognize this? Did you understand the situation? And not to call anybody out. I mean, I would never do it publicly, of course, but I think that there is also a real lack of awareness of the small steps that we can take to make people feel like they are recognized and that they are heard. And like you said, Leslie, at the end of the day, they will decide whether or not they belong, but we can create an atmosphere for them to make that easier for them to do it, right? And feel like they belong.
What advice would you give? Oh, sorry. You had started giving such great advice. I was going to say, what other advice does anyone have in regards to inclusion and equity and learning?
I think it starts with that light bulb moment, doesn't it? Of just pausing and even asking the question, not assuming that the way that one slice of society or culture does it is the way to do it. It's that taking that moment, taking that step back and thinking, okay, what other ways are there to do this, and how can we make that happen? There will be steps that follow that, but I think it all starts with just recognizing that not one size fits all.
Yeah. And I would say, for those who have the ink in the pen, the one who holds the budget, you cannot think that you are going to put out a meaningful and impactful learning program without investing in it. Because if you and we see this so often in our business, right? Where people say, yeah, we want to change the world and we want to have enablement and we want to do this and we want to do that. And then you ask them, okay, and how much money have you allocated for this? And then what they tell you is completely unreasonable. It's completely
They go, what?
unreasonable. Yeah,
And
exactly.
one workshop doesn't do it.
Exactly.
One module doesn't do it.
No.
Exactly. And so for those who don't want to be performative about implementing learning programs for their teams and for their employees across the globe, they have to understand that costs money to get the great minds like we have on this call today, people who are qualified, people who get it, and people who are willing to work in a co-creative way to develop something that lands for your entire organization, just not part of your organization.
Stop making it so generic. Stop being generic with it. Tommy, don't say that to Jane. Jane, don't do that to this. This is how this is going to be done. Give different scenarios, but give it from speaking to people that live in that culture so that it resonates with them, so that they can understand how it can add to their life. Make it added value as opposed to this is something I have to do to get to this next stage of my job or to the certificate. Really think about who your audience is and then curate. That's my favorite word with learning now. Curate the learning opportunities.
Yeah, one thing I wanted to add is this is where kind of like I'm a big advocate for design-led learning, where we're really thinking of, how can we design, like we're designing this for people, but also ideally with people. So that co-creative element, but where we are centering the person and not always, like I know this is difficult when it comes to budgets, but not always just centering the organization or the business impact, but also what people are actually participating in these programs, how they're growing and maturing and developing in their roles and their different work areas. And I think that sometimes there's this disconnect that it's learning for learning's sake to drive the business forward and not just learning for the sake of people, real people who have so much nuance and complexity. And when you don't spend enough time in that co-creative kind of energy with them, they're doing even just research, the bare minimum, surveys, some focus groups, some testing, even user testing, like test out your learning experiences perhaps before you roll them out just to get some feedback. Even those small things can, I think, can make a big impact. So I know we're coming up on our last few minutes. So I don't know if we want to go around and share anything that we haven't had a chance to share and say our goodbyes.
I would love to hear what has been everybody's insights from this conversation. What's one thing that's really stuck with you?
Oh, I'm going to go back to my old saying, nothing about us without us. If you're building something for someone, for a community, for a segment of people, make sure that they are involved in the process. And then once they're involved in the process, take a step aside and still make sure who else is in the room.
I love that, Leslie. I think that's the real thing that kind of stood out for me as well, is that idea of co-creation. I know it's been floated around throughout our conversation. And I think, that just applies through all stages of the process. And even the stages that I've been involved in is making, when you get something then that's ready for translation, is making sure then you're still checking in with the people that it's destined for. And is this right before it goes any further? So yeah, I love that word, co-creation.
And I would say, look at, we're 4 women with completely different backgrounds, but all specializing in a way that can add tremendous value. And so one of my messages and takeaways would be, keep searching for the right people. The talent is there, right? You don't have to go for the cheapest solution. Look around, take time, find the people who are dedicated and who understand and who have a lot of diverse experience, as every single woman on this call has, so that you can really do right by your learning investment. And that would be my message to anyone who's listening. take your time and find the right folks to help you, because you don't have to have all the expertise in-house, but you do have to bring in the right people who are aligned and can help push you and also challenge you a bit to get out of your box and not do things the way that they've always been done.
Yeah, and one kind of key takeaway for me, and I just always go back to this word or phrase, and that's lived experience. And I think a lot of the times when we think about learning, we talk about expertise, and a lot of times it's professional expertise. You have a specialization in a specific topic or area. And I think we've all talked about how our lives, our experiences in different countries, our exposure to different cultures and languages. So even Emily, in the translation and localization work that you do, that repeated exposure allows us to really elevate the impact of learning experiences, to really take into account the diversity of learning preferences and styles and motivations, and also, how people navigate the world and where they may or may not feel belonging. So for me, it's just kind of like, how do we bring that pillar of lived experience to the design of learning programs and learning experiences, and that it's not just about hard, again, I don't want to talk about hard skills and soft skills, but it's not just about that, what we learn in school or what we learn in formal kind of professional environments, but it's also, what we learn in life and how that molds and shapes us. And we can bring that into learning and have that resonate with learners of all backgrounds.
This has been an amazing conversation. When can we all get together in one country? Emily, Sharon, Sandra, where are we meeting? Where are we just taking
Vienna?
over the world?
It's fine.
Vienna? I've never been to Vienna. I'm up for that.
I guess I'll go back. It's been amazing speaking with each of you. Thank you so much for
Likewise, Leslie.
It's been a real pleasure, ladies. Happy to meet you all. And we are all, Leslie, you and I are just connected now on LinkedIn, and Emily and Sandra, we already were connected. So I look forward to following you, and hopefully we can meet individually or collectively. Share some more ideas, because I think we have a lot to talk about.
I think we do. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, all.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.
I was so glad we were able to bring together such a diverse group for this episode. Each person's experience brought us both incredibly inspiring and occasionally shocking discussion. What did you think of this episode? Did our guest experience resonate with you? Please do let us know. Our contact details are in the show notes, along with how to make a donation to help keep the podcast running. A massive thank you to our 4 stars for giving up their time and honestly sharing their own experiences and wisdom. You can find links to all the references that they mentioned in the podcast show notes, along with Sandra, Sharon, Emily and Leslie's profiles and contact details. We'll be back in a couple of weeks with another superb episode, and next time it's the Working Mum one. As always, thanks for listening, and we'll see you again soon.